for a lovely evening conversation. It's going to be great. It's a great little chat we're going to have here. It's Sunday night. I know many of us are anticipating work in the morning, getting back into the swing of things. So if you're one of those people, I hope that this provides good distraction. Perhaps you're listening to this tomorrow morning on your way to work. Perhaps you are, I have no idea, your life. Maybe you're somebody who works on a weekend or you work night shifts and you're listening to me now. Doesn't really matter exactly when you are listening to me or why you're listening to me. I'm just glad to have you here. So glad, so glad. So glad to be here with all of you. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. You want to get that notifications bell because then you get invited back, right? Then you find out the next time I'm going to do one of these, and you do that. So please hit the notifications bell. Tonight, I will give my opening remarks, as I always do. I'll be writing down those super chat questions as they roll in. Then, after that, I will then do the roll call, and then after that, I will answer your super chat questions until we're done. That's how the agenda works here. Someone says, not a question, just want to plug Space Commune's new film, Consumerism, Can We Buy a Better World, which exposes the degrowth agenda. Wow, I have not heard about this film, but there you go. Thank you for the super chat. I just gave you the opportunity to plug it. Folks have questions, just let me know. I write them down. First part of the show is my opening remarks. Second part of the show is the roll call. And third part of the show, the third part of the show. The third part of the show. The third part of the show is me answering your questions. And then when the questions run out, then the show stops. And then we all come back for another round next time I decide to go live. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Always a pleasure to interact with all of you. We are like a little community here. We have our running jokes, unnamed water beverage, unnamed diet water, single family home ownership. Very good. Family home ownership. Very good question. Very good question. And we've got our unnamed diet beverage. We've got our catchphrases like we need a government of action that will fight for working families, and out of the movement to the masses, out of the movement to the masses, right? We are city builders. We're doing great. We're doing great. Our community is doing great. A lot of people have been subscribing lately. So keep it up. If you're here, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Don't let the YouTube algorithms unsubscribe you. Make sure you stay subscribed. Paragus wants to thank me for my fantastic and insightful answer to your super chat question. Well, you're very welcome, Paragus. I'm really glad that I gave you an insightful answer. I'll have to roll back. I don't remember which was your question last night, but I'm glad I gave you a good answer to it. And that's how it works. So keep asking questions. I keep answering good things. So, folks, I guess we'll just jump right into my opening remarks. Keep the super chats rolling in because that's what I'll do for the second half of the show. We'll just jump right into it. So, I am going to use a situation that every so often there's like a news story. There's something that's happening. Oh, Gramsci. Very good. Gramsci. Cultural hegemony. Every so often, there is a news story that captures the essence of so many important points, right? So many important points are like tied in with this one news story that you can just talk about this one news item and you can talk about one aspect of it and make a lot of political points. You can talk about another aspect of it and make a lot of political points. You can even talk about another aspect of it and make other political points. And this one news item has so many political lessons in it. And you can come at it from so many different angles that it's almost a gift that this news item is happening, even if it's a bad thing, even if it's a bad news item. In this case, it's a bad thing, I would argue. Well, it might, in the long term, who knows what it'll lead to, but it's a bad thing at the moment. But right now, Folks, here in the United States, we know nothing about British politics. It's kind of sad. I mean, we're lucky. I mean, Americans don't know Democrats and Republicans practically, but you ask average Americans, even though we have this special relationship with the United Kingdom, even though the UK and the USA are very, very close, even though they say that, in some ways, I've heard people argue that the USA is more English than England, right? That we're more culturally Victorian. Britain has kind of gotten over a lot of the Victorian stuff, but we're still Victorian, and we're more culturally Victorian than the UK is. Regardless, we just don't understand British politics. So let me catch you up to speed. There are three major parties in Britain right now. There is the Conservative Party, or the Tories. There is the Liberal Democratic Party, the Lib Dems. And there is the Labour Party. The Labour Party is considered the left-wing party. They're nominally a social democratic party. They used to have a clause in their constitution called Clause 4 that called for the public ownership of the means of production. They got rid of Clause 4 in the early 90s. So technically they're not really social democrats anymore. But the British Labour Party is one of the major political parties in the United Kingdom. It has been around for a long time, well over 100 years they've been around. And Tony Blair was from the Labour Party, and a lot of very prominent, a lot of prime ministers have been from the Labour Party. They call themselves a democratic socialist party, anti-communist, pro-imperialist, invaded Iraq, the Iraq War, etc. But they're tied to labor unions, and they're a major political party in the United Kingdom, the Labour Party. All right, Nigeria, oil nationalized. The Labour Party. The Labour Party. All right, concrete ways to implement nationalizing banks. All right. Concrete ways to implement nationalizing banks. And the Labour Party has had a little bit of a problem in recent years. They had a problem because, even though they were supposed to be a left-wing party, even though they were supposed to be the voice of the working class and the labor unions, they had Tony Blair and New Labour, it was called. And they came in and they argued that socialism is outdated, class struggle is outdated. Tony Blair brought neoliberal economics into the Labour Party. In the 1990s, the Labour Party did pretty well, but it was dominated by neoliberal economics. And then, to top it all off, Tony Blair supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq, supported George W. Bush's war. And so the Labour Party was cast into a bit of a crisis by that, because many of the people who voted for the Labour Party didn't agree with neoliberal economics and free market reforms. And on top of that, the overwhelming majority of the people who voted for the Labour Party were opposed to the invasion of Iraq. So the Labour Party had a bit of a crisis. So 5-6 years ago, the Labour Party took a left turn. They took a left turn. They said, okay, we're going to get our base back. We're going to let the rank and file of our party feel like they've been heard. And the Labour Party swung to the left. And they put Jeremy Corbyn, a longtime socialist and an anti-war activist, a genuine progressive-minded guy. They put him in charge of the Labour Party. And he won. He was the Labour Party candidate, and he wrote a very left-wing platform. But he opposed Brexit, even though the British people voted to break with the European Union. Which is something socialists in Britain have long opposed, because it strengthens multinational corporations and hurts British workers. It hurts British labor unions and such. And regardless, the British Labour Party, even though they had this very left-wing platform that called for making businesses into worker cooperatives and all kinds of things, even though that was in their election manifesto, they still supported not carrying out the Brexit. They still tried to basically overturn, overturn wealth gap in China. Basically, tried to prevent the United Kingdom from leaving the European Union. And so the Labour Party, they went down in flames. They just went down in flames. And so as a result, the left wing of the Labour Party has kind of been blamed for that. And so now Jeremy Corbyn and the more left-wing voices in the Labour Party are being blamed for the poor performance of Labour in recent elections. And we're seeing the rise of now Keir Starmer as the leader of the Labour Party, and he's much more of a centrist and a conservative. Now, what's interesting is that the leader of the Labour Party, when it was taking its more radical left-wing turn, was Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy Corbyn, has not only, opposed Bush's invasion of Iraq, protested wars, but Jeremy Corbyn has spoken up for the Palestinians. So a huge campaign started in the Labour Party to accuse Jeremy Corbyn of being anti-Semitic. And the idea was that Jeremy Corbyn hates Jews. Jeremy Corbyn is just a seething hater of Jews because he's criticized Israel before, because he said that he would sit down and talk with Hezbollah and Hamas, because he gave an interview with Press TV, God forbid. Jeremy Corbyn has been accused of being this vile anti-Semite and a supporter of terrorism because he would talk to the Palestinians, etc. So Jeremy Corbyn is out. He's no longer the leader of the British Labour Party. And so now Keir Starmer, who is the leader of the British Labour Party, and he's a conservative and a centrist. He's not an anti-war activist. He's not a socialist like Jeremy Corbyn. He's not really a social democrat even. Because of that, now Keir Starmer is going to purge the Labour Party of the factions that supported Jeremy Corbyn. Now, this is big, right? In the United States, we have a completely different political system, right? Bernie Sanders didn't get kicked out of the Democratic Party when he didn't win the nomination. Didn't happen. South Africa. Didn't happen, right? He's still, he's still a Democrat. I guess he's technically an independent, but all of his supporters are still Keir Starmer. All of his supporters are still in the Democratic Party. But we now have this situation where the Labour Party is going to expel all the people in the Labour Party, not all of them, but many of them, all the blocks of people in the Labour Party who were big supporters of Jeremy Corbyn. They're going to purge them from the party. They're going to kick them out and say you're not welcome in the Labour Party. And the Labour Party has a history of doing this. George Galloway, a man I deeply admire, a former member of Parliament in Britain, he was kicked out of the Labour Party for opposing the invasion of Iraq. And he was kicked out by Tony Blair. And he got back into the Parliament. He was elected by another party, but, he was kicked out of the Labour Party. And that they do this. They kick people out of the Labour Party. So right now, they are purging the Labour Party of these more left-wing voices who supported Jeremy Corbyn. And they have a list of different organizations they're going after. There's a group called Resist. They're going to get rid of them. There's a group called Labour Against the Witch Hunt, which was a group that defended Jeremy Corbyn. China economic activity in Africa. Another group, I'm trying to remember the different groups, but one of the groups they're going after, one of the groups they are going to purge from the Labour Party is called Socialist Appeal, and it is the British wing of a Trotskyite group called the International Marxist Tendency, the IMT, right? It's a Trotskyite group. It's been around for a long time. And at this point, the Labour Party is going to ban the International Marxist Tendency. If you're a member of the Socialist Appeal or the International Marxist Tendency, if you're found to be that, you are kicked out of the Labour Party. You're not welcome in the Labour Party. That's the policy that Keir Starmer is going to implement. So here's the thing. Here's the thing that we need to know about this, right? I don't like Trotskyism. I don't like Trotskyism. Not a Trotskyist. I don't particularly care much for the international Marxist tendency. For a while, they were supporting Venezuela, and then they kind of betrayed Venezuela and stabbed Venezuela in the back. Labor and Tories are the Democrats and Republicans, two cheeks of the same backside, says David Fox, and you are exactly right about that. I am not a big fan of Trotskyites, not a big fan of the IMT, and I'm also not a big fan of the Labor Party. The Labor Party is not a socialist party. It's not a socialist party. It's not a socialist party, and it's a pro-imperialist party. And, the people that I listen to in the UK about politics have all been advocating a break with the Labour Party. For a long time, they've been advocating a break with the Labour Party. They've been saying, cut the link with Labour. Cut the link with Labour. They've been, saying that they need to break with the Labour Party. So, I don't support the Labour Party, and I don't support the international Marxist tendency. But I don't think that this move to purge the international Marxist tendency from the Labour Party is coming from a good place. It's not coming from a good place, right? Do we really think that is Keir Starmer purging the Labour Party is Keir Starmer purging the Trotskyites and kicking the IMT out of the Labour Party? Is he doing that? Is he doing that because they're Trotskyites and they're not true revolutionaries? They're not really anti-imperialist? No. Is Keir Starmer purging them because they don't have good positions on countries like Iran and Cuba and Venezuela? No. No, the purge is coming from the right. It's coming from the right. And it is McCarthyism. It's McCarthyism, and it's similar to the campaign that was waged against Jeremy Corbyn, claiming that because Jeremy Corbyn had dared to, criticize Israel, dared to want to sit down and negotiate with the Palestinians, that he was an anti-Semite. It's coming from a bad place. It's coming from a bad place. So that's one angle, right? I don't support Trotskyism. I don't support the British Labour Party, but I have the common sense to see that the purge of the IMT is coming from a bad place. And this is the important thing, right? If the purge of the IMT, if it was like a mass revolutionary socialist group and they kicked out the IMT for their bad position on Libya and they're supporting the overthrow of Gaddafi, I might support that. But in this case, I can see that they're kicking out the IMT because they're critical of Israel. They're kicking out the IMT because they advocate more left-wing, non-neoliberal policies. And it's coming from a bad place, and you have to assess that. You have to assess that, right? You have to assess events like this. You have to assess these events. You have to understand what direction these things are coming from, right? And in this case, as much as I don't like the IMT, I don't like Trotskyism, I can tell that this purge is coming from the right. It's coming from the right. And here's another angle on this. And this is just classic, right? So you all know I wrote a book called Bread Tube Serves Imperialism by now. I'm sure some of you who watch this channel might be even a little tired of hearing about it. Well, I wrote this book, Bread Tube Serves Imperialism, because I was informed that there is an individual named Steve Hassan. Steve Hassan. He's the leading cult expert in the United States, and that he is tied with American intelligence agencies. His advisor and his mentor is Robert J. Lifton, the world-famous U.S. military psychiatrist. Steve Hassan was involved with the Cult Awareness Network and was involved, in involuntary deprogrammings, i.e. kidnappings of people. That Steve Hassan is not a good dude, okay? And he's got ties, he's got friends on the inside. And I talk about this in the book, right? That he's got a very nefarious record. He called for millions of Americans to be deprogrammed from Donald Trump. And he wants mass deprogramming of Americans. He said that on CNN. Now, Steve Hassan, right? not coming from a good place, and he's been advising BreadTube and helping cultivate their message as an attempt to deprogram the alt-right and deprogram Trump supporters. So I talked about this in an interview, right? And, it's not that the man never says anything that might be good or whatever, but, I talked about him. And I did an interview with Jackson Hinkle, and I mentioned to Jackson Hinkle that, the reason I wrote this book is because of Steve Hassan, and the tip-off I got about Steve Hassan and his ties to BreadTube and all of that. And that's the reason I wrote the book. And so I was reading the comments, which I do read the comments. And I was reading the comments of this interview, and someone said, yes, well, Steve Hassan has just decided to go after the international Marxist tendency. And I thought, really? I thought that was really odd because, I have been doing left-wing stuff for years. I know people that are in the international Marxist tendency. It's not a cult, okay? It's a Trotskyite group. I mean, it's just, they sell newspapers, they have meetings and conferences. It's a Trotskyite group, right? So I go to Steve Hassan's channel. And there we have Steve Hassan interviewing an ex-member of the international Marxist tendency, declaring the international Marxist tendency to be a cult. He's declaring that the IMT, the international Marxist tendency, is a cult. He's got this young man who's like, yes, I hated Jeremy Corbyn. I hated Jeremy Corbyn. I considered him to be a terrorist and an anti-Semite. But I was brainwashed by the international Marxist tendency to campaign for Jeremy Corbyn. And you watch this, and Steve Hassan is sitting there, and he's like, yes, yes. He's got his little, yes. And he's sitting, and, this young, yes, how was I brainwashed? Well, I went to the organization's website. All on my own, I went to their website, and I read several of their articles, and based on that, I thought it might be a good organization to join, so I went to one of their meetings, and that is where I was brainwashed by the international Marxist tendency. I'm watching this interview, and I'm sitting there like, it's like the cringiest thing. And so Steve Hasson's like, Sal, can you tell us about what you did in this organization? Like, how were you brainwashed? And he's like, well, once a week in the organization, we would distribute our newspaper, and we would encourage other people to read the newspaper of the international Marxist tendency. It was diabolical. And sometimes we had meetings. Yes, we had meetings of the international Marxist tendency, and there would be speeches given at these meetings, and people would listen to those speeches and become convinced of our ideas. And I'm listening to this, and I'm just like, I'm waiting for the cult part. I'm waiting for and then they told you to never speak to your family members again, and give up all your life savings, and they gave you a new name and shaved your head, and you had to have sex with the leader 5 times a day. I'm not hearing it. I'm hearing sometimes people would come to one meeting, and we would take their phone number, Steve, and sometimes we would even call them back and ask them to come to the next meeting. It was awful. I mean, it was horrible. It was a cult. It was a dangerous cult. And I'm listening to this, and I'm just like, this is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. Like, he's sitting there, and Steve Hasson's like, yeah, that's just like when I joined the Moonies. We used to take people's information and call them on the phone also. I mean, it's totally a cult. I mean, it's like the most culty thing. I'm listening to this, I'm like, okay, this is the dumbest thing. And he's sitting on there, and he's like, I'm so happy that I've been deprogrammed from the international Marxist tendency. I can't believe that I campaigned for Jeremy Corbyn, who's a terrorist and an anti-Semite, and I am so sorry for supporting Jeremy Corbyn. And Steve Hasson's like, well, we all make mistakes, I was brainwashed into the Moonies, I mean, some people think I'm a communist, but look, I'm helping you stop being a communist. It's amazing. I mean, I'm watching this, and my head wants to pop. My head wants to pop. I'm thinking you joined a group that sold some newspapers. They sold newspapers, and they had meetings where people listened to speeches. my friend, that is not a cult, okay? I want you to go look up Waco, Texas, and the Branch Davidians. That's a cult. Look up Jonestown. The Jonestown massacre in Guyana, where people drank cyanide and died. That's a cult. People talk about, but I mean, I'm listening to this. This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And I'm just sitting there, and it's like, I don't know. Steve Hassan is supposed to be this cult expert. He's supposedly studied every dirty, rotten, murderous, group of, extremists who blow themselves up, and he's sitting there. Yes, we handed out newspapers. It was awful. It was diabolical. And I'm like, this is like unbelievable. So, but I didn't know about the whole Labor Party thing. So, I'm just like, okay, whatever. And so then I randomly come across a news story that announces that, it just so happens that Keir Starmer is about to purge Socialist Appeal and the IMT from the Labor Party. And I just had one of these I've been having all of these moments lately, folks. I really have. I published this book, right? And I published this book for one reason. One reason. I published this book because more people listen to BreadTube than listen to any communist group in the United States. And BreadTube is miseducating people about Marxism. So I decided I needed to write a book about BreadTube. And the icing on the cake, that made me actually go ahead and write it was when I found out Steve Hassan, the cult expert, is advising them. So, I wrote this book, and I thought, wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great if like all these BreadTubers would like advertise it, if they would like take the bait and like flip out? And I thought, they're not going to do that, though. Maybe they'll make a comment on it. They're not going to do that. And I was wrong, right? I didn't even, the book wasn't even available for purchase yet. And Surfing USA has a screen, has sharing the screen and showing people the image of it and talking about it. Oh my God. And, he's talking about it. He's never read it. No one's ever read it. It's not been published yet, but he's explaining to everybody it's about how Caleb thinks that BreadTube are plotting his assassination, blah, blah, and it's going crazy. The book comes out, and then, they're reading from it and taking passages, and they're advertising it like crazy. And Vosh is talking about it on his streams. And like Vosh, he's got a lot of hardcore fans, like him. I don't understand that. But he tells his fans, this book is all about me. The entire book is about me. Caleb wrote a book about me. There's like 3 pages on you, dude. But he's telling his fans, who are like obsessed with all things Vosh, it's all about him. And so they're they all buy it. And I mean, it's like every day I get on there and there's like 30 copies sold, 40 copies sold. I'm just like, how is this happening, right? I mean, it's like hundreds and hundreds of copies of this book are selling because the BreadTubers are telling everybody about it and waving it all around. And so, and the name of the book is BreadTube Serves Imperialism. So then, immediately after that, Vosh announces that he supports the U.S. keeping troops in Afghanistan. Just like to prove the point of the book. And he gets on his stream and he's like, and just, if we don't pull out of it, if we don't pull out of Afghanistan, then China will go in there, and China is bad. And Vosh has this whole clip where you can find Vosh supporting U.S. intervention in and saying that we shouldn't remove U.S. troops from Afghanistan. It's like the title of the book is BreadTube Serves Imperialism. And Vosh is on there justifying the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan to serve imperialism. And then, the color revolution starts in Cuba. And again, Vosh is on there, these protesters against communism that support the blockade and want to overthrow Cuba, they have a good point. It's like, again, he's trying to prove me right. And so then, now, we've got Steve Hassan. Now he's got Steve Hassan, the guy that I found out on good authority is advising BreadTube, who I maintain is tied to American intelligence. Now he's doing hit pieces to help the British Labour Party purge socialist appeal, purge the IMT. He's doing pieces on there, and he's like, yes, the Trotskyites, they sell newspapers. That's pure cult activity. I mean, once a week they went out to sell a newspaper. That's cultism. And he's like, yes, I was brainwashed into supporting Jeremy Corbyn, a terrorist. I apologize deeply for the brainwashing. And it's like, so Steve Hassan is proving my point. I'm just like, I mean, is that... sometimes I think BreadTube secretly likes me. I do. I really do. Sometimes I think that BreadTube secretly is on my side. Because it's like they're giving me favors. They cannot stop talking about my book. It's like they will not stop talking about it. They make it all about their personalities, which it's not. They claim that there's whole chapters on Vosh, which there aren't. And like they're talking about me, right? And then they're proving my point when they're supporting the destabilization of Cuba and supporting the occupation of Afghanistan. And then the guy who I wrote the book because I found out he's advising them as like a deprogrammer, this deprogrammer from the 70s. He's on there helping Keir Starmer purge the British Labour Party, for goodness. I mean, it's like, and thank you, Andre, for your super chats. Much appreciated, Andre. It's like they're proving my point. I mean, it's like they're trying to help me. They are really, I mean, it's like, they might as well just get on there, and Vosh might as well just get on there and say, Caleb was right, I serve imperialism, blah, 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 blah. And Surfing USA, he should get on there and be like, buy Caleb's book, and what's his name? Steve Hassan should get on there, and everything Caleb says about me is absolutely right. It's like, yes, Caleb is right about you, Steve. BreadTube serves imperialism, and that's what we support here. I mean, it's like, this is amazing. I mean, it's like, are these people trying to help me? These people trying to, like, I mean, it's weird. It is weird. It is weird as hell. I have never seen anything like this. They're trying to help me. I swear. So that was the first angle, was that even though I don't like Trotskyism, even though I don't support the Labour Party, I oppose what Keir Starmer is doing because it's coming from the right, right? I oppose it. That's the first point. Second point, Steve Hassan serves imperialism and is tied to American intelligence, which I showed in my book via Robert J. Lifton, via all kinds of other things. His interview with Jordan Harbinger, where he hints at inside information about the Unification Church and their ties to the CIA. I document in many pages in this book, I talk about his ties to the American establishment and the American elite and American intelligence. And now, he's going after Trotskyist and leftist groups. And so we've got, Steve Hassan working arm in arm for the best impressions. Thank you very much. I'm having fun here. So we got Steve Hassan working arm in arm, with the leadership of the British Labour Party, trying to make the case that some little tiny Trotskyist group that sells newspapers is a dangerous cult. So now, here's the other point I want to make. I want to make this other point, right? So we talked about, how there's another point we can make about this, right? Which is this, right? So I watched the interview Steve Hassan did with the young guy, and he's explaining why he quit the International Marxist Tendency, which again, if this is a cult, like he should have, like his quitting should have been like him, like taking a knife and like, what is his quitting? Did he had to like take a knife and hold it to the throats and say, let me out of the house now. I mean, no, his quitting was he wrote a resignation letter, right? And then they said, okay, bye-bye. Such a cult. I mean, I don't know. I mean, but anyway, his quitting, this is why he quit. This is why, this guy who was interviewed on Steve Hassan's video, this is why he quit the International Marxist Tendency. It's why he quit being a Trotskyite, is because they maintained, the International Marxist Tendency maintained that Lenin and Trotsky were different than Stalin. That Stalin's brutal authoritarianism and repression was totally different than what Lenin and Trotsky believed. And he read about the Kronstadt massacre, or not a massacre, it was the putting down of the Kronstadt uprising. And he read about the kind of political repression that went on during the time when Trotsky was still in the leadership of Russia, during the time when Lenin was still in charge of Russia. And based on that, he determined that the group was wrong, where they tried to separate Stalin from Lenin and Trotsky. And that he argued that there was heavy political repression that went on during the period when Lenin ran the Soviet Union, and that Stalin didn't just invent it. It wasn't just evil Stalin, that Stalin was continuing what Lenin started. Well, here's the thing. That kid is right. He's right. There was heavy political repression during Lenin's time, just like there was during Stalin's time. And that's one of the big flaws in Trotskyite thinking. It's a big flaw in Trotskyite thinking. You know, under the leadership of Lenin, the Bolsheviks outlawed factions in the Bolshevik Party. The Bolsheviks outlawed the Social Revolutionary Party. They outlawed the Left Menshevik Party. They put down the Kronstadt uprising. That all happened when Lenin was in power. It happened, and if, again, this fiction that Trotsky believed in democracy, he was a good democratic socialist, but Stalin was an evil authoritarian. No, it's not actually true. Trotsky executed all kinds of people. Trotsky presided over all kinds of executions and political repression. He just so happened didn't like it when it was his faction that was being repressed. And this points to an important point. So this will be the next point that we get from this crazy story about Keir Starmer. Why did Lenin outlaw the left Menshevik and the left Socialist Revolutionary Party? Why? Because the Soviet Union was invaded by 15 different countries, and they were fighting for their lives. 15 different countries invaded. There were people starving because there was a blockade. They couldn't get food. They couldn't get medicine. And the left Menshevik Party and the left Socialist Revolutionary Party were engaging in destabilizations and assassinations. And so they outlawed them. And why did Lenin ban factions in the Bolshevik Party? Again, because they were under attack and they needed to have the most ironclad discipline. They didn't have time to, play Model UN and have different groups fight each other. And no, they had to have ironclad discipline, right? People, we don't understand, and I've said this so many times, we do not understand Lenin and the Bolsheviks, right? A week after the Bolsheviks took power, right after the Bolsheviks took power, right after the October Revolution, there were drinking parties all over the Soviet, all over the areas they controlled, St. Petersburg and all that. People were drinking it up and getting drunk on vodka and celebrating. They're like, we finally made the revolution. They were celebrating. They were getting drunk and celebrating. And the Bolsheviks said, we really need to build an army because there's, the white army, that wants to restore the Tsar. They're mobilizing. So we have to fight them off. So what did the Bolsheviks do? They confiscated all the alcohol. They militarily conscripted all the men, and then they implemented the death penalty for drinking alcohol. And it was enforced at least a few times. There were people who got the death penalty, were shot for drinking alcohol. Folks, I cannot ever imagine a situation where I would execute somebody for drinking alcohol. Ever. It sounds horrible. That sounds like the worst. I cannot ever imagine a situation where that would be okay. And you know why I can't imagine that? Because I'm not living in Russia in 1917, okay? I'm not living with mass starvation and death on my doorstep. This was a military situation. A country was fighting for its life. And under such circumstances, extreme measures are taken. And it wasn't evil Stalin, who executed people for drinking alcohol. Oh no, it wasn't even evil Trotsky. It was it was Lenin. It was a week after the revolution. They had to implement this rule, no drinking of alcohol. And if somebody drinks alcohol, we shoot you. That is an extreme level of, the circumstances that give rise to that level of authoritarianism are not, that's an extreme situation. And that's what the Soviet Union was up against. That's what they were up against. They were blockaded. Millions of people died because the USA and Britain and France and Germany and a number of countries, blocked food and medicine from getting into the country. The British military was sent to Azerbaijan. There were U.S. troops. There were even some U.S. Marines and U.S. Army reservists who were sent to go put down the Bolsheviks. It was an extreme, awful situation. It was a civil war in which millions of people died. There was a humanitarian crisis. There was an economic blockade. And in those circumstances, the Bolshevik Party was forced to become very, 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 very authoritarian. Very, very authoritarian. Very authoritarian, right? Labor history books. Very authoritarian. Labor history books. In order to survive, they had to become very authoritarian. And we cannot imagine those circumstances. We, living in Western capitalist developed countries hundreds of years later, 100 years later, we can't imagine this. We cannot imagine what these people were facing. But it was socialism. Monthly review. It was socialism that got them from those dire circumstances to industrializing the whole country, wiping out illiteracy, defeating the Nazi invaders, inventing space travel, making amazing breakthroughs in film, amazing breakthroughs in music, Shostakovich, Sergei Eisenstein, empowering women. What they accomplished in the face of those horrendous circumstances is nothing short of a miracle. What the Soviet Union accomplished. The fact that they were that desperate, they were in such desperate circumstances where they're drafting all the men and they're shooting people for drinking alcohol and millions of people are dying and they got from that to being a fully industrialized country, to inventing, launching the world's first spacecrafts, launching people into orbit, making amazing films, having, amazing achievements in gymnastics and athletics, wiping out illiteracy. This is nothing short of a miracle that socialism accomplished. And that is what I take from the Soviet experience. And that's it. That's it. That is it. That is it. That's it. Because I obviously am not trying to recreate the Soviet Union. We're in very different circumstances, in very different times. What I take from the Soviet experience is that socialism works. If socialism can withstand all that they were up against and accomplish so much in spite of all of those horrendous realities, in spite of being in desperate, desperate circumstances that necessitated brutal authoritarian policies, that's what I take from the Soviet Union. The socialism works. The same can be said for China. Look what they were up against. One of the poorest countries in the world, and they have turned it into socialism works. And we can learn from Russia, we can learn from China, but we're in completely different circumstances in the West. Completely different circumstances. Completely different circumstances. Right? Cuba, completely different circumstances. What I take from the Soviet experience is not that Lenin and Trotsky were good and Stalin was bad. It was not that if only they had listened to my one... No, I'm real about this. I am totally real about this. And this is why this kid, I realized that Lenin and Trotsky had been authoritarian just like Stalin. I had been brainwashed. He doesn't understand this. Yes, Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin were all authoritarian for the same reasons, because of what they were up against. And that the way the Soviet Union was, the way Cuba is today, the way North Korea is, this is the result. This is what happens when a society is under attack. This is what happens when a society is barricaded and blockaded. And if you want to help the people of Cuba, if you want to help the people of North Korea, if you want to help the people of China or Vietnam, instead of going around and saying, oh, you're Stalinists, you're Stalinists. No, you should be working to help them have economic development. You should be working for the blockades to be lifted. You should be working to empower and allow socialism to flourish and blossom so that these societies aren't under straight up attack. So these societies aren't required to take these harsh measures. If you want the socialist countries of the world, the countries that have broken free from Western capitalism, to be more open and free societies, you need to get the imperialists off their back. You need to be opposing the blockades. You need to be favoring economic development and trade with these countries. That's what you should be doing. And you should be not supporting people that want to tear them apart with civil war, not supporting, fake CIA-led protest movements against them, but rather doing your duty as a person in the homeland of decaying, dying imperialism to get the imperialists off their backs. To get the imperialists off their backs so these societies have room to breathe, for goodness sakes. And imagine, think of all the Soviet Union accomplished. All they accomplished. Imagine if they hadn't had the threat of nuclear annihilation from the United States hanging over their head. Imagine if the Nazis hadn't invaded and killed 27 million people. Can you imagine what socialism would look like if it didn't have the boot heels of U.S. imperialism beating down on it every day? The fact that socialism has been so successful in eradicating poverty, industrializing countries, wiping out illiteracy. Imagine that it didn't have the boot heels of U.S. imperialism on top of it. Its achievements would be astronomical. Astronomical. We'd be living in some kind of science fiction, high-tech, utopia, for goodness sakes. So that's what I take from the Soviet experience. That's why I'm a Tanky and I'm not a Trotskyite. And this guy who's a Trotskyite, he was not given a scientific understanding of the Soviet Union. He was given a narrative of the Soviet Union that's not even consistent with what Trotsky said. The narrative that he got of the Soviet Union was that the Soviet Union was democratic. It was a democratic and socialist society where everyone was free. But then Stalin came in and crushed the freedom. And that's malarkey. That's not what happened. And that's not what Trotsky said. And that's not what anybody said. The difference between Stalin and Trotsky was absolutely not that Stalin believed in brutal authoritarianism and Trotsky believed in democracy. That is not what the difference was. Stalin and Trotsky both believed that Lenin was correct in outlawing the two opposition parties. Thank you, Stephen. Stalin and Trotsky both supported the crushing of the anarchist Kronstadt uprising, the uprising demanding Soviets without communists, the uprising that didn't want a coordinated response to the attack, during the Civil War, that wanted, autonomy where every region could do its own thing. No. Stalin and Trotsky agreed on all of that. What Stalin and Trotsky disagreed about was the theory of permanent revolution. Trotsky argued that the Soviet Union should not sign peace treaties with Britain, not sign peace treaties with France, not sign peace treaties with the United States, but instead of industrializing and trying to raise its people out of poverty, that it should become a base area to spread chaos and instability into Western Europe. That the Soviet Union should merely be a temporary holdout in the global struggle for permanent revolution. And Stalin said that's not going to work. In order to industrialize, we're going to need technicians from General Electric to come in and help us build our power plants. And we're not going to get them if we look like we're trying to destabilize and cause chaos in the United States. We're going to need technicians from British companies to come in and help us set up our car manufacturing and our steel manufacturing. And if it looks like we're trying to violently overthrow the government of Britain, that's not going to work. And, China is this big country on our border, and in China, there's kind of a progressive government led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And yeah, sure, Dr. Sun Yat-sen's not a communist, but he's friendly to us and he's anti-imperialist. So we're going to give military assistance to Dr. Sun Yat-sen. We're going to be friends with China because they're against the imperialists. And Trotsky says, oh no, you can't have British technicians come in. Our job is to be, fomenting violence and civil war in Britain. Our job is to be fomenting violence and civil war in the United States. And oh no, we can't be supporting Dr. Sun Yat-sen in China. Oh no, we can't be doing that because he's not a true communist. In fact, we should be fomenting violence and civil war against Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, he's a bourgeois nationalist, and we should be having our communist leaders in China go around killing people in Sun Yat-sen's movement. Trotsky was an ultra-leftist. He was a petty bourgeois radical who loved violence. He was very much and he hated the peasantry. He hated the peasantry with all his heart and soul. He was a racist. He thought the West was the best. Nothing matters until we seize Western Europe. That's the theory of permanent revolution. Until communism reaches Western Europe, nothing matters, right? He said New York City is the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. Nothing matters until we get the West, and you can't have socialism for real. You can have kind of a proletarian government, but you can't really have socialism in Russia or in China or in Vietnam or in Cuba or countries like that because they have peasant populations, and peasants are backward and reactionary. You want to know what Trotsky's really about? You go read the first couple paragraphs of his biography of Stalin. Trotsky wrote a biography of Stalin. Did you know that? And the first couple paragraphs, he accuses Stalin's tendencies, Stalin's problems, he blames Stalin's authoritarianism or whatever on his race. On his race. And he says Stalin is Asiatic. Stalin is Genghis Khan. You read this. Trotsky is basically saying the reason that Stalin is an authoritarian is because he's not Western European, because he's too Asian. He was born in Georgia. He's not civilized like they are in Britain and France and America. He's Genghis Khan. He actually calls him Genghis Khan at one point. Trotsky is a Western chauvinist. He's a Western chauvinist, right? Trotskyism is not Marxism. It's petty bourgeois ideology. David Fox, you are absolutely right. The Proud Boys, those white supremacists, what do they chant at their rallies? West is the best. West is the best. That's what Trotskyists believe. The West is the best. And the only place that can truly have communism is the West. That's what Trotskyism is. Trotskyism refuses to break with classical Marxism. Marx, he thought communism would first come in Germany and France and Western Europe. Well, Lenin came along and developed the theory of imperialism. And Lenin showed that in the Western countries, there was a stratification of the working class, that sections of the working class were being bought off and becoming the aristocracy of labor, and that because of that, their revolutionary energy would come from the East. And it would come from countries like Russia and China and Vietnam and Angola and Korea. The reason being that in those countries, it wasn't just the workers who were being oppressed. It was the entire nation was being oppressed. That the global system of monopoly capitalism was keeping entire nations poor. And so the working class, the most progressive revolutionary class, would sit at the center of a revolutionary united front against the imperialists. That's what Lenin said. And Lenin developed a whole new method of organizing called a party of new type. And it was a different style of organizing. It wasn't a debating society. It wasn't a liberal political party. It was a more Eastern political model. People said it reminded them of a monastic order. It was a group of people, a secret society of people who gave the whole of their lives to the struggle to bring down the imperialists. Leninism was a break with classical Marxism. Trotsky could not break with classical Marxism. Trotsky held on to the idea that the West is the best and that it's going to be, those Western factory workers, one day they're just going to rise up and seize their factories and that'll be communism. That's Trotskyism. And Trotskyism is racist, it's Eurocentric, and it's not Marxist. Okay? And this guy, the reason that he ultimately cracked and decided to go on Steve Hassan's, tell us why it's a cult. Tell us why it's a cult, And the reason he cracked and he got on there is because he realized that their argument that these Trotskyites make, that that Lenin and Trotsky were democratic, but Stalin was authoritarianism. But he was smart enough to realize that's bullshit, because it is bullshit. That's not what happened. That's not what the debate was about. It's not even what Trotsky's ideology was about. Okay? So he's smart enough to see through the flaws in Trotskyism, right? His organization never helped him to understand why the Soviet Union became authoritarian, never helped him to understand why countries like China and Cuba and Vietnam have had to have authoritarian methods be practiced, never understood that. Never gave him an understanding of what these countries are up against, why they have developed the way they are, and, let me add, all they've accomplished, never gave him any of that. All they said to him was, when right-wingers came up to them and said, hasn't communism failed everywhere it's ever been tried? He would say, why, yes, it has, but that's because it was Stalinism. We are Trotskyists. And after a while, 1 or 2 years, this guy figured out, wow, that does not make any logical sense. I guess this group I'm in must be a cult. I'm going to go back to being a conservative. It's the flaws in Trotskyism. Trotskyism as an ideology is incoherent, right? Trotskyism is an ideology. Trotskyism exists for one reason, and one reason only, right? We are browbeaten. We have it just pounded into our heads in the United States that communism has never had any success anywhere. Communism, everywhere that there's been a socialist government, it's been authoritarian and brutal and repressive. This is pounded into our heads. And it takes courage, intellectual courage, to be able to just stand up and say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but the emperor has no clothes. Some things are true. Some things are not. It isn't as if the U.S. hasn't been authoritarian either. The crackdown on George Floyd protests. That's true. What's the body count? How many protesters were shot? That's a very good point, Jay Grimes. How many protesters were shot during that whole thing? But Trotskyism doesn't have an answer. And it's basically, we're browbeaten over the head with the lies about communism. And Trotskyism exists, and it's for people that they just want to go every time they're confronted with that. They say, oh, don't worry, we're the good socialists. It's because it appeals to people's intellectual cowardice. It's a way that people can be socialists, they can say they're socialists, they can say they're communists, but they can say they're socialists, they can say they're communists, but they don't have to actually defend existing socialism. They can support imperialism. That's basically what it is. Trotskyism is a loophole through which you can be critical of capitalism. You can say that the Russian Revolution was good, but you can support the imperialists. Someone once told me, Trotskyites are for revolution until it actually happens. And that's a very good way of looking at it. They're for a revolution until it actually happens. And then they denounce it as Stalin, as Stalinist. Oh, where did the permanent revolution come from? We'll write that down. Origins of permanent revolution. They're for a revolution until it actually happens, and they're against counter-revolution until it actually happens. They're for a revolution until it happens, and then they declare it Stalinism, and they're against counter-revolution until it actually happens, and then they declare it to be this righteous workers' revolt. When the Soviet Union was falling in the 90s, the color revolutions and all of that, the Trots were all cheering for it. They thought it was great. The Trots are all supporting the protests in Cuba right now that are being clearly supported by American intelligence. The IMT Trotskyites that I'm now defending against Keir Stammer right? Because it's coming from the right. It's not coming from a good place. They supported the overthrow of Gaddafi, right? They're against counter-revolution in theory until one actually happens, and they're for revolution until one actually happens, and then they declare it to be counter-revolution, right? Trotskyism is not good. And the reason this guy, if you listen to him, his disagreement that he had with the group he was in, was based on the fact that he saw through. He was smarter. This guy, this guy was smart enough to see that, that he was being fed a line of bullshit. He was being fed a line of bullshit when they said to him, "Oh, all the socialist countries are evil, but they're just Stalinist." But unlike Trotsky, who was pure and democratic, he saw through that. He saw that that was a bunch of malarkey. I wish he would have seen through it and become a real socialist. I wish he would have seen through it and been smart enough to just say, and understand it, but he wasn't given the proper orientation. So I just wanted to comment on that. That Keir Stammer story gave me an opportunity to talk to you about all kinds of different things. But Steve Hassan serves imperialism. BreadTube serves imperialism. My book has been proven more right than ever before. Trotskyism serves imperialism. But we carry with us the flame of genuine revolutionary Marxism. We at the Center for Political Innovation, we believe in scientific socialism and anti-imperialism. We want a society where the banks, factories, and industries are organized to serve public good and not profits. We want to eradicate the system of imperialism, where big banks and monopolies hold back economic development and keep the world poor. That's what we aim to do. And we have our 4-point program. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need to engage in socialist education. We are the city-building tendency in human history. It's much bigger than socialism and capitalism. This is a battle that has gone on within the human species, within the human psyche for thousands of years. The city-building tendency versus the vandal tendency. And we are the city-building tendency. We are the city builders. So I just wanted to use this whole Keir Stammer incident and Steve Hassan and all of that to make that point for tonight. So on that note, folks, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Now we'll do our roll call, and then I will start answering your questions, your Super Chat questions. So keep the Super Chat questions rolling in. I'll keep answering them. And names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? Tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Springfield, Missouri. Excuse me. All right. Excuse me. All right. We've got Springfield, Missouri, Zach, Elias from Finland, Jesus in Los Angeles, Christian from North New Jersey, JT24 in Mississippi, Bendigo, Australia, Nate from Chicago, Char Darling in Nassau County, good friend of the program, Ryan in Auckland, New Zealand, Stephen Clearly, Jeff in LA, San Antonio, Texas, Anti-Imperialist USA, Joey in New Jersey, good friend of the program, great fellow, Tamara and Dario from Brooklyn, Io, Hillary in New York, shout out to you, good friend of the show as well. Kushik from Kolkata, Tristan from Maryland. Tristan is great, guys. Check out Parasocialite, great channel. Richmond, Virginia, Brad in St. Louis, John Witt in Houston, Indonesia, Pitano, Clydebank, New London, Wisconsin, Mo in Toronto, Happy Valley, Oregon, Daniel, Los Angeles, Ghani, Texas, Mechanicsville, Virginia. That's a neat name, Mechanicsville. Springfield, Missouri, Detroit, Michigan, Billy Kane in Gateshead, England, Nick Lynch in Fairhope, Alabama. The Orange Duke stands with Caleb, wherever Caleb is. Well, thank you, Orange Duke. Great stuff. Southern California. Kieran from Red San Diego. Welcome, Kieran. Tony from Tasmania, Southern California, Southern Utah, Tennessee. Lynn from Portland, Oregon. Brother's House in College Park, Maryland, says Chaya. Very, very good. Very good. Grimbus in D.C., Lockport, New York. Leo from Mexico. Up in Maine, says Andy Finaro. Andres from Norway. Ithaca, New York. Michael Rosterucci, good friend of the program. Grand Junction, Colorado. Queensland, Australia. Shout out to everybody in Australia. I hear you're locking down again, and it's not fun. My heart goes out to you. Sure hope that doesn't happen here, and we're with you. AJ and NJ. Cincinnati, Ohio, Jenny Lynn. Carmen in Reading, Pennsylvania. Mo in Pomona, California. Nate from Sydney, Australia. Javier Torres, City Builders. Kansas City, Missouri. SF Thomas. SoCal, Tom Farras. SoCal, so red, so red. Sweden. Cleveland, Mohsin from Iran. Grand Traverse, Michigan. The heart of U.S. imperialism, Max the Sax. Calgary, Canada. Cabo Verde, Eduardo Camillo. Los Angeles, Arkansas. Kendall in San Diego. Glasgow, Scotland. Rhode Island, says Frank. Welcome. Heathrow, Ukraine. Arturo in Anchorage, Alaska. Berlin, Cincinnati, Ohio. Marty, Tucson, Temple, California. Grand Canyon, Arizona. Costa Rica. Wow. Northern California is not a verb. That's right. Alrighty. Florida, Sean Hazley. Great stuff, folks. Great stuff. So why don't we start Fort Lauderdale, Sir Craigie, very good. All right, why don't we start answering these super chat questions? Keep them rolling in, because that's the second half of our show, is me answering questions. First question, single-family home ownership in socialist countries. The rate of home ownership in socialist countries is higher than the rate of home ownership in the United States, for the most part. In Cuba, almost every family owns their own home. If you live there for 2 years, you own it. And your rent can never be more than 10% of your income. Right? In China, the rate of home ownership is much higher than in the United States. This notion that we have, that socialism means the government comes and takes your house because it's private property, is false. A home that you live in is not private property. That is personal property. It is for your own use. Private property refers to the means of production. It refers to items that are used simply to make money. The Kroc family, in theory, are the owners of every McDonald's, but I doubt they have entered most McDonald's, right? Their only relationship to it is their certificate of ownership, right? But if you live in your house, it is your personal property. If you live in your car, live in your car, but, if you own your car, if you drive your car around, it's your personal property. Anything you use, is yours. And Marxists want personal property to vastly expand, but they want private property to be operated for the basis of the community, publicly owned. So there you go. Yeah, and the rate of home ownership is higher. And in fact, President Xi Jinping has cracked down and significantly reformed Chinese law in relation to real estate speculation, and made the point that houses are for living in, not for profits, not for speculation. And that's a big problem. That's why the real estate prices in New York are through the roof. It's because housing in New York City is not for living in. We have all kinds of empty apartments and all kinds of homeless people, right? The way people make money in the real estate market, and Trump started this out, right? Trump was kind of the pioneer of this, but it was going on long before him. Real estate speculation, where you buy a property, you wait for the market to go up, you buy another property. That's the game. All right, Gramsci and cultural hegemony. It's funny. It's a very good question, Io. When I was in college, I took sociology. That was my minor. I took political science, which was my major. I took history courses, in the history department, and in many classes, deconstruct the deconstructionist mindset. Many classes. We read Gramsci. We had quotes from Gramsci. I remember seeing quotes from Antonio Gramsci on the PowerPoint presentations, and Gramsci was frequently quoted. And I would tell people, did you know that Gramsci was the head of the Communist Party of Italy? And people would not know that. Gramsci was head not of the Socialist Party, not of the Social Democratic Party. Gramsci was the leader of the Communist Party of Italy. And in fact, the reason that he wrote his famous prison notebooks, from which his concept of cultural hegemony is derived, the reason he wrote those notebooks was because Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator, put him in prison. And he was put in prison. You lost me there. I don't know what that's about. They put him in prison. And he was put in prison by Benito Mussolini. And in prison, they censor your mail, right? You know, and anyone who's ever been to prison can tell you this, right? Your mail is not private. The prison guards read the letters that come in, and they read the letters that go out. So Antonio Gramsci, you know, he wanted to write. He wanted to take his time in prison to put out some academic work. But he knew that if he was writing communist propaganda, the guards would cut it off, because this was fascist Italy. So he wrote his prison notebooks, his very famous prison notebooks. He wrote his prison notebooks in code. And he talked about the theory of praxis rather than Marxism, because if he'd have said Marxism, then they would have, censored his letters and not let him do it. So instead of saying Marxism, he said the theory of praxis. And instead of saying the bourgeoisie or the capitalists, he would talk about the powers that be, or the wealthy folks. Instead of talking about the struggle for socialism, instead of talking about the workers' revolution, he would write in a much more careful language. And the thrust of his prison notebooks was documenting how culture is dominated by those who control the means of production, that the capitalist class, through their ownership of the means of production and the means of communication, are able to kind of define the culture, and that the culture in every society is rooted in the economic base. Marxists, they talk about the family structure is rooted in the economic base, how the political system is rooted in the economic base. Well, the culture is also rooted in the economic base, and the culture, the art, the music, the writing, the literature, all of this is used to reinforce the society at hand. And that's Gramsci. He wrote a number of essays. So there you go. That's Antonio Gramsci. Doctrine of Fascism. Look. That's Gramsci. And because he wrote in code, it's acceptable to talk about it in academia. It's not considered to be Marxist propaganda. It's considered to be this highly intellectual stuff. The Frankfurt School really liked it for that reason. The Frankfurt School also was very much about, it was Herbert Marcuse, who was kind of the intellectual father of the Frankfurt School, the West German Marxist philosophers who were covertly supported by the CIA. Der Monat, which was the German magazine that was CIA funded, that promoted their work and was distributed everywhere across West Germany. The Frankfurt School, they really liked Gramsci because their thing was that they said that the workers were not revolutionary, that rather the revolution would come from the intellectuals, right? It'd be the intellectuals who would make the revolution. And it was, rather than it being a struggle of the worker and the capitalist in an economic sense, it was a battle for the culture. It was a battle for ideas. And that's Herbert Marcuse, that's the Frankfurt School. And the Gramsci stuff, which focuses on the concept of cultural hegemony, it kind of reinforces their message. Now, what's particularly interesting is that Pete Buttigieg, his father, was the president of the International Gramsci Society. Did you know that? Pete Buttigieg, the pro-imperialist, centrist Democratic candidate who fought in Afghanistan, his father was the president of the International Gramsci Society and was one of the leading scholars of Gramsci in American academia. And that, there was all kinds of CIA work to promote Antonio Gramsci and to promote, and this is the right-wing conspiracy theory about cultural Marxism. And this is where, again, the breadtube crowd doesn't really help us when they talk about this stuff, because it's like, okay, right? When the breadtube crowd, they talk about cultural Marxism, what they're describing is an academic current, like academic social liberalism, that was largely about, breaking liberal intellectuals away from actual Marxism, right? The Frankfurt School, you know, this kind of thing, Pete Buttigieg's father, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, all of this stuff was being supported by the CIA, Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt, right? All of this stuff was being supported, Herbert Marcuse, was being supported to pull people away from Marxism. But it was a school of thought. It's a school of thought, a way of understanding things in a Marxian way that is pro-imperialist. Okay? And that's, Gramsci is utilized by these people. Gramsci was not one of these people. And his writing, his prison notebooks are very good. You read the prison notebooks of Gramsci. I mean, they're written in kind of coded language. He's not using explicitly Marxist terms, but it's still good stuff. I would agree with most of what he put out. The stuff on Fordism and Henry Ford is fascinating in the prison notebooks. The essays where he talks about Henry Ford and Taylorism and how all across Europe there's this obsession with American efficiency. That's really good stuff. It's really interesting stuff. So, I would recommend Gramsci's actual writings. I think you can learn from it. But, it's also important to point out that there's a reason he's promoted and he's used by a cultural movement that was backed by American intelligence. All right. Nigerian oil nationalized. Well, you have to remember that a lot of oil around the world is nominally nationalized. Before the Islamic Revolution of Iran, the Shah's oil was nationalized, but it wasn't. Right? It wasn't. It was just, it was like nominally nationalized. In Venezuela, the oil of Venezuela was nationalized like back in the 50s, I think. But it wasn't until Hugo Chavez came in and until 2003 when he completely changed the way the state-run oil company worked. It wasn't really nationalized. Nigeria, the oil is not really nationalized, right? It may nominally be nationalized, but ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron have unlimited access, right? It's just the state functioning as a middleman. You can look at who some of the billionaires in Nigeria are, and they're people that just kind of oversee allowing the access of ExxonMobil to certain areas. The Niger Delta region, that's the region where most of Nigeria's oil comes out of, is the Niger Delta region. Go to Google now. If you really want to know what imperialism is all about, go to Google right now and type in Niger Delta region. Right? And look at this area that is, at this point, it is the most profitable part of the African continent. No part of the African continent is making as much profits and wealth as the Niger Delta region. And look at the conditions these people are living in the Niger Delta region. You'll see children playing on beaches that are black with oil. You will see people that are, killing wild animals and eating them. You will see, it's never dark in the Niger Delta region because there's always fires, because there's so much oil in the water. There's always fires. There's always an oil fire somewhere in the Niger Delta region. It's absolutely horrendous stuff. There's always fires going on. The air is very, very polluted. I mean, you breathe it in, and it's very, very polluted. The population there live in desperate poverty. Yeah, that's the Niger Delta region. And that's the story of Western capitalism and imperialism. It's actually interesting. In the 90s, there was an intellectual, an academic in Nigeria who was a critic of Shell oil. His name is escaping me, but he was a college professor, a very prominent college professor in Nigeria, who was critical of Shell oil. And he was arrested and tried and hung within 8 hours. The military arrested him and hung him 8 hours after they arrested him. It was just boom, boom, Nigeria, they've had a series of military dictatorships. Right now, the president, Buhari, of Nigeria, is a former military dictator. During the 1980s, he was the military dictator. Now he's been elected. I mean, he's the elected president. Before him was Goodluck Jonathan. Nigeria is a very, very, very populous country, very big population, lots of poverty. There's a lot of malnutrition happening in Nigeria right now because of the pandemic. There's a lot of malnutrition in Nigeria because of the pandemic situation. And There was the Islamic movement of Nigeria, which were Shia Muslims that were aligning with Iran, that were trying to make peace between Christians and Muslims. There has been Christian-Muslim civil war in Nigeria many times. There's Boko Haram, which is the terrorist group. They call themselves the African wing of ISIS, and they have support from local government forces in some parts of Nigeria. Buhari is a Muslim. Karo Wiwa, that's who it was. Yes, that's the guy. Thank you for the super chat there. Karo Wiwa, who was just abducted and executed, because he was opposing Shell Oil. So, so don't think, no, Nigeria, that's capitalism. That's Western domination, that's capitalism. All right, next question. Bum, bum, bum. All right. Concrete ways to implement nationalizing banks. Well, I would maintain that the nationalization of banking, you should have local banks, state banks, and federal banks, right? That there would be banks that are government owned, that would have a certain amount of resources they can lend. People can deposit their money into government banks, and get it out, right? And that banking would be in the hands of the state. It's not that difficult. Many countries around the world have a national bank. I mean, nationalized banking is, it's not a very difficult thing, and that there should be a monopoly on the lending of money at interest in the hands of the state, right? That only the state, only government banks, be they local, state, or federal, can lend money, so that the lending of money is done in the interest of the country overall, right? And we can, the government can decide strategically, right? If they want the rate of home ownership to increase, if they want more people in a neighborhood to own their own homes, the government can approve all kinds of loans for people to, have mortgages and buy their homes. And as they pay them off, the government money goes into the public budget and takes the place of taxation. If someone wants to start a business, they need a loan. Well, they go to the local bank, the state bank, or the national bank, and they say, I'm going to start this business. I need a loan. And they make the case that they need the loan. If that's the case, then the loan is provided, and they pay back the interest into the public budget, right? That's the idea of a national bank, of state control of banking. And then the state will assign credit, not simply based on what's profitable. I mean, obviously, you'll have to show that you could pay it back, and there'll be, just like now with any loan you get, there's a set interest rate and all of that. But on top of that, the credit will be assigned strategically based on what the state decides is in the overall economic interest of the country. That's my vision of nationalizing banking, right? And and it would get rid of predatory credit card stuff. It would get rid of situations where neighborhoods have foreclosed, homes. It would allow the strategizing of industry and subtle, government guidance of how the economy functions. So there you go. The wealth gap in China. Well, the wealth gap in China, right? And again, first of all, we need to get this notion that socialism means everything is equal. We need to get that right out of our minds. Right out of our minds. We need to get that out of our minds. Socialism is not everyone gets paid the exact same wage no matter how hard they work. That's not what it is. All right. Implications of Rossi. Implications of Riazi. That's not what it is, right? Socialism means the means of production, the centers of economic power, are forced to work in the interests of society overall, not simply the profits of the few, right? And what you were told in school, I was told in school, I had a teacher who said, communism, imagine I gave every kid in this class a C, no matter how hard they worked. That would be communism. Bullshit. That's not what it is, right? And so, this idea of, well, China can't be socialist because it's, there's not total equality there. I'm sorry. That's got nothing to do with Marxism. That's not, no. Socialism is not everyone gets paid exactly equal. No. And in fact, I'm going to read to you what Lenin said. This is from The State and Revolution. Lenin said, in the communist society, which has just emerged into the light of day out of the womb of capitalism, and which is in every respect stamped by the birthmarks of the old society, that Marx referred to as the first or lower phase of communist society, The means of production are no longer the private property of individuals. The means of production belong to the whole of society. And that's how it is in China, right? There is not an inch of private property in China. The means of production basically are forced to do what the party says. There might be, some cases that, quote unquote private ownership, but they don't have freedom. They don't have, property rights to it. The government can make them do what is in the interest of society overall. There's 5-year economic plans, right? Every member of society performing a certain part of socially necessary work receives a certificate from society to the effect that he has done a certain amount of work. With this certificate, he receives from the public store of consumer goods a corresponding quantity of the products. After a deduction is made for the amount of labor which goes into the public fund, every worker therefore receives from society as much as he is given to it. The first phase of communism, therefore, cannot yet provide justice and equality. Let me read this. The first phase of communism, therefore, cannot provide justice and equality. Differences and unjust differences in wealth will still persist. This is Lenin. Differences and unjust differences in wealth will still persist. And so in the first phase of communist society, usually called socialism, bourgeois law is not abolished in its entirety, but only in part, only in proportion to the economic revolution so far attained, only in respect to the means of production. The bourgeois law recognizes them as private property. Socialism converts them into common property. But to that extent, bourgeois law disappears. So there's inequality in China. But here's the thing. The inequality that exists in China is the result of the fact that there's been so much growth in China. Right? Didn't used to be that so many people in China had been lifted out of poverty. It used to be that, most of China in the countryside didn't have running water, didn't have electricity, and didn't have very much. And in the cities, they were slightly better off. Well, now we have a situation where China is booming, and there is a very big middle class, and there's a number of capitalists that the government are trying to control. And yes, there has been big economic expansion in China. And when you have that level of economic expansion in a country of 1 billion people, mind you, where there's still very poor parts of the countryside, there's still very remote regions of Tibet where people just got running water and electricity, and you also have mega corporations like Huawei, the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. Yes, there's going to be a gap. The people in the mountains of Tibet who just got running water and electricity and the CEO of Huawei, there's a big difference there. And China, through development, is working to eradicate that. The road to eliminating inequality is abundance. Inequality fades away when there is abundance. The basis of inequality is scarcity. When there's not enough to go around, some people get more than others, and people aren't happy about it. But when there's enough for everybody in a post-scarcity society, there's not inequality. Why would anyone hoard? If there's enough for everybody, no one feels a need to hoard, right? And that Marxism understood this, and you cannot build an egalitarian society, a society without inequality. You cannot build an egalitarian society on the basis of scarcity. And that's what we learned from the Cold War. And Karl Marx makes that very clear in his critique of the Goethe program. And it's a very important point. And Lenin says that in The State and Revolution. But throughout the course of the Cold War, when these countries were barricaded and attacked, that was lost. And that was our mistake. And Deng Xiaoping reasserted that. Deng Xiaoping discovered that point and understood this, that you cannot build an egalitarian society on the basis of scarcity, that socialism requires vast material abundance. That was Deng Xiaoping's great discovery, and he rescued Marxism from the delusion that you could get to a higher stage in poverty, because you can't, right? The basis of inequality, the basis of social hierarchy, the basis of the state is scarcity, and that this is what a lot of people do not understand about Marxism. The situation right now in South Africa is very, very disturbing. There's a lot of rioting going on, and Jacob Zuma has been arrested, and And look, I mean, there's a lot of frustration. The pandemic has exacerbated economic problems in the country. But largely, there's a feeling that the economic revolution has not been completed. Apartheid was overturned, but there has not been the mobilization of socialist construction that is needed, right? And that a lot of things in South Africa remain very unequal. There's a lot of extreme poverty and such, and that the time has come to move toward socialism, right? And that there's divisions, and that there's people in the African National Congress, there's people in the Economic Freedom Fighters organization. There's a lot of division in the group, and now the fights among the party elites, and the arrest of Jacob Zuma, and the population that is hungry and angry. I mean, things are changing, and there you go. Um, Examples of China's economic activity in Africa. Well, I'll give you one example. Here's one example. When I was in Russia at the World Festival of Youth and Students in 2017, there was a group of people from Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe. And I met with, some people from Zimbabwe. They were part of the ZANU-PF, the Zimbabwe African National Union, right, which is the ruling party of Zimbabwe. It's a Marxist party. One of the things they talked about, it's because of China that now tourists can visit Victoria Falls, the biggest waterfall in the world, one of the natural wonders of the world. Victoria Falls is in Zimbabwe. It's named after Queen Victoria. Zimbabwe used to be Rhodesia. The British got there and they said, wow, isn't this an amazing, amazing waterfall? We'll name it after Queen Victoria. So there's Victoria Falls. It's a huge waterfall, the biggest waterfall on Earth. And it's in Zimbabwe. But because of the sanctions, U.S. tourism, they can't go there, right? The U.S. government makes it very hard for tourists to get there. It makes it very hard for American tourism companies to work with there. But because of China, there's now a hotel next to Victoria Falls. And people from around the world can go to Zimbabwe and go to Victoria Falls. And you might think, well, that's a little thing. Like, what is that? It's some tourism or something. Well, for a country like Zimbabwe that has a lot of very, very, very poor people in it, that's a big deal. The fact that tourists can now visit Victoria Falls, and that wouldn't have happened without China. China built the roads to get up there. China built the hotel, and China has enabled this part of Zimbabwe's economy to greatly expand. Now, people can visit Victoria Falls. That's because of China. There's many other examples. China has built, the first big example of Chinese intervention in Africa was in Tanzania when Julius Nyerere, the African socialist leader of Tanzania, had a partnership with the Chinese Communist Party to build railroads. And China built railroads in Tanzania. And, China made a big point of doing it in a very egalitarian way. The wages and the conditions of the Chinese workers were just the same as the African workers. And China built railroads in Tanzania. And that was a very big deal when they did that. I believe it was in the 60s, late 60s and 70s. China built railroads in Tanzania. And I read a book about this. I read a book on China's, work in Tanzania. There's a very good book, on this. There's a lot that the Chinese Communist Party published about how they were building railroads in Tanzania, how this was an act of solidarity with a developing country. But they've continued building railroads. They've continued building highways. Look, Angola, there are parts of the country that did not have any access to roads and such, and it was Chinese companies that partnered with the state-run oil company of Angola to build roads, and bridges, through Angola, right? I mean, the U.S.-backed civil war where the USA was backing the terrorist thugs of UNITA to try and destabilize Angola, that war came to an end in 2002. And as the oil prices were rising, the slogan was "Angola starts now," and with Chinese assistance. Bridges were built. Bridges that had been blown up in the Civil War were restored because of China and in cooperation with China. Angola was even able to develop its own cell phone company and have their own cell phone company. So yeah, I mean, Chinese activity in Africa has been quite massive. Chinese investment has really helped, and often the United States and European countries utilize the UN to stop Chinese economic development in Africa in the name of environmentalism. I mean, that's a big thing that Joe Biden has included in his platforms. He wants to stop China from building power plants in Africa because they pollute too much, right? China builds coal power plants in developing countries. The United States has coal that contributes to climate change. So, the USA has been able to stop a lot of power plants from being built, hydro power plants and coal power plants that China has wanted to build in Africa, right? And what is it really about? Is it really about that it's bad for the environment? No. It's about the fact that the USA wants these countries as poor captive markets. Look, folks, I'll tell you this. When I was a kid in church, I remember there was this group called, it was UNICEF or whatever, and we had these little boxes, and we'd put, little coins in these little boxes to UNICEF, UNICEF. And what were we doing? And what were we doing when we were putting these, our change into these little boxes? What were we doing? Well, we were told we're going to help some poor African village get a well, right? There's some poor African village somewhere where they don't have a well. But if you put your nickels and your dimes into these little paper boxes and you take them back to Sunday school with you next week, why, well, every kid in every church will do this. And some African village, they'll go and they'll dig them a well and they can have a well. Well, the thing is, right? This is missing the essence of the problem. This is missing the essence of the problem. China is trying to help African countries get out of the situation where they don't have modern running water, modern water systems, modern power plants, and all of that. That's what China is trying to do. China is trying to build infrastructure, power plants, water systems, raise these countries up so they have a level of economic development. The United States says, oh no, that's imperialism. What the United States does is it trades with these countries, keeps them as captive markets, keeps them poor, but then, every so often they dig a nice little well in the middle of a village. The people have no idea. When they say China is being imperialist, no. Imperialism is about holding back economic development. China is stimulating economic development. So there you go. There you go. Labor history books. A number of very good labor history books. Labor's Untold Story by Herbert Moraes, and there's another author, I can't remember his name. That's my favorite by far. Labor's Untold Story. That's the best one. Labor's Untold Story. There's a if you want from a Trotskyite perspective, there's a book called Labor's Giant Step by Art Preece, and that's from the Trotskyite perspective about the building of the CIO. Returned about climate change in this context, but they help developing countries in an ecologically friendly manner. Or they build fusion power, Labor's Giant Step. There's a very good book called Brother Bill McKay by Philip Bonosky, and it's about how they brought how Ford Motor Company was unionized. It's a biography of Bill McKay, who was the Scottish-born labor organizer who unionized Henry Ford's the Ford Motor Company. I would recommend the History of the World Trade Union Movement by William Z. Foster, right? He wrote the History of the World Trade Union Movement, the History of the Labor Movement of the Entire World by William Z. Foster. That's very good. I'm trying to think what other histories of the labor movement that are out there. There's a lot of good ones. There's the Teamster series. If you want to read the history of the Teamsters Union, the history of the Teamsters Union, right? The Teamsters Union. There's, what's his name? The Teamsters Union. What is his name? He was the Teamsters Union, right? Farrell Dobbs, who was the Trotskyist, who built the Teamsters Union. He wrote a book called Teamster Rebellion. And it was about the Teamsters strike of 1934. Then he wrote another one called Teamster Power, and then he wrote Teamster Politics and Teamster Bureaucracy. It's a 4-part series about the Teamsters Union and how the Trotskyites built the Teamsters Union. It's a fascinating history of the Teamsters Union from the perspective of the Trotskyite communists who were involved in building it. But there's others. There's other good books out there that I would recommend. Mike Quill, who was a labor organizer but also a writer. He wrote The Big Strike which is a history of the dock workers' strike in San Francisco in 1934. That's very good. That's a very, very good book. Um, Geez, wow. I mean, you're asking me for labor history books. I could keep going. Obviously, Howard Zinn, a lot of people really like Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, and that has extensive labor history in it. A lot of people like Howard Zinn's stuff. Yeah. Where do I begin? I mean, wow. Labor history. So we talked about Farrell Dobbs. We talked about Arthur Preece. We talked about Brother Bill McKay by Philip Benoski. We talked about William Z. Foster's History of the World Trade Union Movement. I think we talked about Labor's Untold Story, which is by far the best book out there. There's a very good book called Red Chicago by Randy Stork, which is about the Communist Party's organizing in the Great Depression in Chicago. That's very good. There's actually a very good book on the history of the British labor movement. I really liked, and it was called Unemployed Struggles by Wal Hollington. And it was about how the unemployed coal miners and other people in Britain organized during the Great Depression, and that's very, very good. So there you go. Yeah, that should be enough. I think. I mean, it's what I can name off the top of my head in good labor history books. Monthly Review magazine is great. I mean, I've always learned from it. I don't always agree with them. They maintain that China is not socialist, which I don't agree with. But they tend to be anti-imperialist. It's a good publication. It's a Monthly Review magazine. Historically they published a lot of very good tanky books. Their publishing company was very good. They published a lot of good stuff on Latin America. Many of the best books on Bolivarianism from like an academic perspective were published by them. It's their academic folks. It's an academic magazine. I haven't read it in a while, but I used to have a regular subscription. I read every issue. And they're anti-imperialists, and they're not where I'm at on China, but they go back and forth. But overall, yeah, I mean, I've always learned of all the Marxist academic journals out there, Monthly Review is probably the best one in the United States at this time, I would argue. They're not necessarily where I'm at on everything, but they tend to be pretty good. I should probably renew my subscription, actually. That's probably a good idea. I should get back into Monthly Review. I have a positive view of Monthly Review. I know I think it's quietly controlled by one of the Freedom Road affiliates, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's like Liberation Road has a lot of influence there. But I don't know that for a fact. I think that, yeah, it's like, it's more academic Maoist kind of folks, right? And they're not, pro-China now, but, I mean, Monthly Review, they would publish all the pro-China books in the 70s. And I think now, if you look at who's on the board of directors, you can see the influence of Liberation Road, which is one of the more academic Maoist-y kind of groups. It's got influence with the labor bureaucracy and stuff, but it's academic Marxist kind of folks, but they publish stuff from from international Marxist academics as well. So yeah, I am not opposed to Monthly Review. I have a positive view of that magazine. The origins of the theory of permanent revolution. Well, interestingly, the theory of permanent revolution, Trotsky admits, was not invented by Trotsky. It was invented by Alexander Parvus. Alexander Parvus. And Alexander Parvus was a Russian-born social democrat who became a German intelligence officer. And he was a good friend of Trotsky's. And it was Alexander Parvus who actually developed the theory of permanent revolution. Trotsky, developed it further. But Trotsky admits that Parvus is the one who developed it. It was Parvus who became a German intelligence secret police officer and an advisor to the Ottoman government of Turkey, a financial advisor to the government of Turkey. Parvus, who arranged for Lenin to go back to Russia on the sealed train. Parvus, there you go. Labor plus Sokdem plans to buy out capitalist businesses. That's funny. Buy out capitalists. All right. How do we deconstruct the deconstructionist mindset? Well, you get people to be part of something real. I mean, the best thing for deconstruction is to just sit on the internet. If you're a Marxist, if you're a leftist or whatever, and you just sit on the internet, you're never going to be part of anything real. But get people off the internet. Get people part of a real organization. Get them to build real relationships with real comrades. Get them to start having a desire to have success. Get them part of a team, and get them feeling like they want that team to succeed. Make them responsible for other people. Make them feel connected to other people. If you can do that, if you can do that, if you can do that, you can deconstruct the deconstructionist mindset. The secret is real relationships. The secret is giving people something to build rather than something to tear apart. Giving people real comradely relationships, getting them involved in real struggles, getting them doing real street outreach, getting them engaging with real people in person. The more that you can make people part of a revolutionary community of solidarity, the more you can break down the deconstructionist mindset. That's my experience. The Doctrine of Fascism, that book is irrelevant. That book is irrelevant. Gentile, Mussolini, all that stuff is irrelevant because there is no fascist ideology. Fascists talk one way in one place, they talk one way in another place, they talk one way in another place. Mussolini was all about futurism and sci-fi. Hitler was all about knights and castles and Wagner. Pinochet in Chile talked one way. The Ku Klux Klan of the United States talked another way. Fascism is about what you do. It's not about what you believe. It's not an aesthetic. It's not an ideology. Fascism is trying to stabilize capitalism with mass destruction, violence, and terror. It is the mobilization of mass violence and terror and destruction in the hopes of stabilizing capitalism. And that's what fascists do. And they use all kinds of different rhetoric to justify it. Sometimes they sound futurist. Sometimes they sound medieval. Sometimes they sound, populist. Sometimes they sound rigid and authoritarian. Fascism is mass destruction and terror to stabilize capitalism. And it doesn't matter what fascists say. So that book you mentioned, The Doctrine of Fascism, it's irrelevant. And it's just irrelevant. I really, at the end of the day, I've read some of that stuff. It's largely irrelevant because fascists are defined by what they do, not by what they say. The implications of Riazi. Well, the United States is going to utilize Riazi to be much more hostile to Iran. They're going to say, look, they elected this crazy extremist. We're not going to negotiate with them. Never mind that Iran elected, a reformist government. And, the reformist government of Iran signed all kinds of deals with the United States, but that didn't make any difference to the United States. The United States still stabbed them in the back. But yeah, the United States will use Riazi, but Riazi will reinforce, though, he will roll back neoliberalism and privatizations in Iran. He will probably enhance the social programs for Iranian working people. He will crack down on a lot of the pro-Western and, pro-imperialist rich who sympathize with the United States and hate the revolution. He will probably reinforce some of the founding principles of the Islamic Republic, which include, anti-capitalism, which include anti-imperialism, also include, very extreme social conservatism and religious principles. But, Riazi will reinforce, he'll probably be more sympathetic to the Revolutionary Guard and such. So I think that, he's a hardliner, right? He's from the hardliner camp. Now, the hardliner camp in Iran, there are different factions within it, right? Not all the hardliners see everything the same way. But there you go. And the last question, what about the idea to buy out the capitalists? Yeah, that's a weird social democratic thing that's been around for a long time. The idea that somehow we can just save up our money. The workers will compile their money into a big fund and they'll buy the means of production from the capitalists. And it's just so ridiculous. And Norman Thomas was pushing this in the 30s. There were even some governments, in Europe. I think Sweden, was it Sweden? That part of the workers' pay went in, to a special fund that eventually would be used for the workers to buy the means of production from the capitalists. And it's like, come on, right? This is again, social democrats don't understand that socialism doesn't just naturally arise. I already talked about South Africa, Richard. I talked about it earlier. I talked about Jacob Zuma. I talked about everything in the country earlier, Richard. So you got to roll back the tape if you want to hear me talk about that, because I already discussed that. But this idea that they're going to purchase the means of production from the capitalists, it's not going to happen. Social democrats think that capitalism, just one step at a time, kind of naturally turns into socialism. Anarchists think it happens without coercion, without state action. Marxists think that there is a struggle for political power, right? That the proletariat needs to seize control of the state and, make a new state ultimately that serves the working class. And with that state, they can create a new economic system, right? And that Marxism is different from other schools of anti-capitalism in that it recognizes there is a struggle for political power. There's a struggle for political power, right? I think there's an old Monty Python sketch where, they have Karl Marx on a quiz show, and they say, so Karl Marx, he says, the struggle between the industrial proletariat and the industrial bourgeoisie is a what kind of struggle? And he says, a political struggle. And that is what Karl Marx believed. It was a political struggle, the struggle for the seizure of political power, right? The Social Democrat says it's a gradual struggle for economic power. The anarchist says it's only an economic, that's thoughts on abolish the Federal Reserve. Well, here's the thing. The Federal Reserve is a private bank. And, the head of it is appointed by Congress, but it's ultimately a private bank. And it's something invented to stabilize capitalism, right? Henry Morgan is largely responsible for it. And there's a lot of, right-wingers who think it's communist somehow. There's a whole book that John Birch Society put out, The Creature from Jekyll Island, about how on Jekyll Island these people gathered and, they proposed, but it's a mechanism for stabilizing capitalism. But it's not a public bank, right? Rather than, getting rid of it, I think what needs to happen is there needs to be some kind of state central, there needs to be a centralization of credit in the hands of the state. You need to have public control of banking, right? And that the Federal Reserve Bank, yeah, it's bad, but it's just one of many bad private banks, right? And ultimately we need banks that serve the people. I've had people try to say that the Federal Reserve Bank is the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto or something. No, it's not. It's a private bank that pumps money in and out of the economy to stabilize capitalism. And it helps private banks profit from lending money, right? From printing money. The printing of money, is a way to make profits for private banks. The Federal Reserve is definitely corrupt, and it's the whole thing. Money is debt. We get into more debt the more money we print, etc. There's a lot of truth in all of that. But at the end of the day, the solution isn't just free market capitalism. The solution is having a government of action that fights for working families, having state power in the hands of the people. It's not libertarianism, and a lot of the anti-Federal Reserve stuff it just kind of pushes a libertarian mindset, and that's not a real solution, right? The Federal Reserve is certainly a problem. It's crony capitalism or whatever, but all capitalism is crony capitalism, right? And, look, this was the U.S. government. The U.S. government is run by the rich and powerful. So when they needed a mechanism for trying to stabilize capitalism, they developed a mechanism that was run by the rich and powerful. It's not that complicated. But there you go. All right, folks. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. Fusion City now. Fusion City now. Fusion City now. Fusion City now. We are city builders. Good night.